Welcome back. All right, so it is well known that I'm a fan of the Canucks. It is also well theorized that maybe I hate the Canucks, or it is theorized that I'm harder on the Canucks than I would be because I want to appear unbiased. I honestly I don't understand how when I was doing the organizational rankings, I couldn't make an argument for the Canucks ahead of other teams. So I have no problem going into why. And this is not hating on the team. It's just being realistic. The idea of being a fan, and there seems to be this idea that if you're a fan of the team, then going into the following season, you cheer for that team and you believe. You believe they're going to win the cup. You believe they're going to make the play. You believe, and you have to believe. Now, I am of the mind that yes, I will absolutely cheer for a team that I cheer for any given game during any given season. Although there are times where if a team's well outside the playoffs, you're like, we want a good draft pick, and that's an argument I've had about the Canucks before, that they haven't really truly bottomed out, and they're still a team that's never really done like a rebuild. They've never had one. And I can get into a why on here. Absolutely, that's easy. And again, these are all reasons why I look at this team and say, as a franchise, and while Patrick Alvin, I think, is still figuring things out, and Rick Tockett's only entering his first full season as Canucks coach, I have some skepticism here. So when we look at, I want to start looking at trades first. Now, the Horvat trade is the first notable one you have to look at because it's part of really a two trades. So he was traded to the Islanders for Beauvillier, R2 Ratu, which I put as Ratu, but of course it's spelled Ratty, but we learned pretty quickly it's not Ratty. And a 2023 first, which was used by Detroit to draft Sandin Pellikka because they traded that first round draft pick to Detroit for Hronek. Now, it's interesting to note that Detroit turned Hronek into a first rounder on the blue line. And the Canucks could use more good young defensemen, and they might have one coming up. But the reality is this is a team that definitely needed to improve their blue line. So the argument is they get Hronek, right? Top four blue liner, and a young blue liner at that. So that's got to improve things. They add Beauvillier, who was better at the start during his time in Vancouver than at the end. And Ratu is still, he's a work in progress. I think he needs another year in Abbotsford. We'll see how it goes. It was not a great run in Abbotsford after the trade from the Islanders. So that trade, is it a win? Well, the Canucks weren't going to pay Horvat, so getting items back for Horvat, absolutely good move. And odds are the Islanders trade was probably the best one being offered. Now, one trade I wanted to highlight too is Travis Hamonic being traded to the Senators in exchange for a 2022 third round pick that was used to draft Elias Pettersson too, the other Elias Pettersson. And he is projected to be a pretty solid defenseman in the NHL. He's not going to be, an offensive dynamo, but he does have an NHL upside. This was a smart move. This was a smart move by the Canucks, and I acknowledge that. And then there's the trade from a couple years ago. And yes, this was by Jim Benning, but it put the Canucks into the situation that they're still trying to bail themselves out of. And it's not easy. This is a team that's above the salary cap currently. And when you're consistently above the cap and you're missing the playoffs, I think that signifies there's an issue there. Either you're overrating your assets and your chances, or you're just not managing the cap very well. And for the Canucks, it might be both. But that trade, Dominic Roussel, or Antoine Roussel, apologies, Jay Beagle, Louis Erickson. Hey, I'm old. Dominic, Antoine Roussel. It's easy to mix the two up. And a 2021 first, which Arizona used to draft Gauthier, and he looks like he's going to be an excellent player in the NHL. A 2022 second round pick, which they used to draft Hunter Height, and a 2023 seventh in exchange for Oliver Ekman-Larsson and Connor Garland. So they traded three contracts that were, seen as anchors. These were contracts that were weighing the Canucks down, but they only had a year left in those contracts. And so they would have had about almost $10 million in extra cap space the next year. But in adding Ekman-Larsson and Garland was a restricted free agent, and then they signed him to the contract where he's paid $4.95 million a year. They actually had less cap space after that trade was done once they'd signed Garland. And the expectation was, well, Ekman-Larsson's still a premier guy. Benning sat there. He's still a top two guy in the NHL. Even though if you'd watched him in Arizona the last couple of years, it was obvious that his best days were behind him. right? So this is where that disconnect between what management sees and then what just fans and media will report on. That's where that's there. And then, of course, June 16th of this year, they bought out Ekman-Larsson, which was the right move. But they shouldn't have been the team that was in a position to buy out Ekman-Larsson. That should have been Arizona. The only teams that Ekman-Larsson was willing to be traded to was Vancouver and Boston. My guess is Boston would have looked at a price like that and said, we don't want to trade a first-round pick. And again, for the Canucks, it was a matter of we're going to trade out these bad contracts. We're going to add a top 4 defenseman and a top 9 forward, and we're going to make our team better. We're going to get in the playoffs. And for the Vancouver Canucks, they've been a team trying to get in the playoffs. Got to get above the playoff line. And the moves they've made this offseason, again, with that in mind. You had Soucy, you had Cole on the blue line, you had Pius Suter and Bluger down the middle. It's not a coincidence that these are guys that are there to support the top guys. It's also not a coincidence that they should be able to improve the penalty kill, which has been atrocious in Vancouver for years. So they haven't been in the playoffs since 2020, and that appearance in the playoffs was the first time since 2015. 2019-2020 is a season with an asterisk in that it was not a full 82 games. At the time the season was stopped, everything was put on pause, Canucks were starting to have some trouble. Markstrom had gotten hurt, Demko had been a little inconsistent. There was some debate about whether or not the Canucks would stay above the playoff line, but by freezing it, and then you had the play-in round, the Canucks beat Minnesota, then they beat St. Louis in the first round. The goaltending for Vancouver gave Vegas everything they could handle. Not quite and more, because then the Canucks would have knocked out Vegas, but they pushed Vegas to 7 games in the second round, and there was excitement. And then they let guys go, and they didn't really make much effort to keep some of the guys who left, like Stetcher, like Toffoli. So that didn't help, right? We had players in Vancouver openly asking why that didn't happen, why they didn't try to keep everybody together. And again, the salary cap has been a problem for Vancouver for years. We'll talk about their contract situation, but that's part of it. But you at least, I would think, would reach out to players and say, hey, so what are you looking for in free agency? And try to figure something out, right, to keep these guys around. Now, when we talk about their drafting, keep in mind this is a team that has only made the playoffs once since 2015. They should be stockpiling draft picks. They should be getting all kinds of really good prospects. And generally, they're not. So this year, they draft Tom Willander in the first round. He may turn out to be a very good player. 2022, they drafted Jonathan Lekkerimäki in the first round. Up and down results with Lekkerimäki so far. He seems to be off to a strong start to a season thus far, but we're not into games that are really important in the European League yet. And so what's Lekkerimäki going to be? They did not have a first-round pick in 2021 or 2020. That's a problem, right? That's a problem not to have a first-round pick. See that first-round pick become Gauthier, who looks like he's going to be an excellent top 6 forward in Arizona. At the same time, they're trying to trade Garland. They bought out Ekman-Larsson. So they didn't get anything out of that trade, and they traded away a first-round draft pick in 2021 that looks like a top 6 forward as soon as this year, which the Canucks need on an entry-level deal. So when you're looking at salary cap situations, as I always say, you need players on entry-level contracts producing for you. That is absolute gold in today's NHL. 2019, they drafted Vasily Podkolzin. Results have been mixed with Podkolzin. The talent's there. He did not have great stats last year. 2018, of course, they drafted Quinn Hughes. 2017, they drafted Elias Pettersson. But that's 5 and 6 years ago, right? And then you look into what do they do beyond the first round. So, yeah, they get Hughes, they get Pettersson. Those guys are great. But outside of that, in later rounds, 2019, they drafted Höglander 40th, and they drafted Silovs at 156. But outside of that, looking for somebody you could say, what a steal, not great. Now, in Jim Benning's case, that was almost unforgivable in that when he was brought in by Vancouver, he was viewed as an excellent scout for the Boston Bruins before coming to Vancouver. And so Vancouver, very often traded away draft picks, which doesn't help your prospect pool. You're trading away draft picks when you're not above the playoff line or just barely in the race. And you're not getting those hits in the later rounds. So this is something that's absolutely hurt the Canucks' depth. It's hurt their prospect pool. Their prospect pool has very often been ranked in the second half or bottom 10, bottom 5 of the NHL, even though they're not a playoff team. And that if you look at the top teams right now with your prospect pools, you're looking at Anaheim, Chicago, Montreal, Arizona, teams that missed the playoffs. They stockpile draft picks, they stockpile young players, and there seems to be a plan there. Now, Chicago just started that plan last summer, and they've already got some really good prospects out of that. There's not just Bedard, there's Korchinski there as well, and various others. And it just feels like there's a plan there. And with Vancouver, it's been, we're close, we want to get in the playoffs. Seems to be the message every single season. And that seems to be the message that they've conveyed to their fans again this offseason. So looking at their contracts, the JT Miller contract, $8 million a year till 2030. Right now, that contract, probably a bit of a bargain for a guy who's going to score at around a point per game, maybe more than a point per game. He has shown the potential for 100 points over the last couple of years, and he definitely played better under Tocchet than he did under Boudreau prior to that. But for Miller, that contract, it's a long deal. I'm not saying that if they kept Horvat and traded Miller and signed Horvat to that deal that people would like it a lot better. But I think it probably would have been better received. The problem is it did feel like Horvat really wanted to just leave. And Miller wanted to stay. So you keep the guy who wants to stay. Pettersson, $7.35 million this year. He's a restricted free agent next summer. Watch for this to dominate the news over the next 6 months. And we'll see whether or not he signs an extension. But at this point in time, it's been put on the sideline. But he's going to command at least $10 million a year on his next contract. Besser, $6.65 million for 2 more years. This is why he's still a Canuck. I think they've tried moving that contract. His agent was given the allowance to talk to other teams. That $6.65 million, not just for this year, but for another year, teams don't want term. A lot of the deals we look at over the last couple of years where teams look like they're getting ripped off, it's because that the team that's ripping them off is taking term. They're taking a player who's got a couple of years left on their contract. And teams generally don't want to do that, so those guys don't have value. Kuzmenko at $5.5 million for 2 years. That's a solid deal. Of course, there's some complaining that, well, he didn't sign long-term, but at least he signed and he stuck around. Garland, $4.95 million until 2026. I don't know how tradable that contract is either. Again, you've got term. It's almost $5 million a year, and we've already got over half the league at or above the cap. Beauvillier, $4.15 million for 1 more year. The most likely, I would say, to be maybe moved and dangled out there might be Beauvillier because he's on an expiring contract. Because, again, they have to get under the cap. They're not under the cap right now. Quinn Hughes, $7.85 million until 2027. There was a lot of not very happy fans when he signed because they felt he didn't sign for the maximum term. So, clearly, he wants out. And if he does, the way you convince a guy to stick around is winning, right? This is the whole thing. You have to show some kind of change. Like for Pettersson, he was drafted 6 years ago. And if the Canucks in 2024 are still not a playoff team, I really don't blame him for saying, it's been 7 years since I was drafted. Maybe if I want to win, I have to play somewhere else, right? Of course, Tyler Myers, $6 million for another year. Still hasn't been traded. And now we're up to September 4th at the time I'm recording this. I would be kind of surprised if he gets dealt. I think the Canucks have tried to move that contract. I don't know who takes it on. Now, of course, the bonus has been paid. There's only $1 million in salary left to be paid. So the cap hit's one thing. Your actual money, you're paying him something else. But if a team's going to take on Myers, I think they're going to say, all right, well, we'll take that contract. We'll also take your first-round draft pick. That was the price the Canucks paid back in 2021. They do not want to pay that in 2024 just to get under the cap. This isn't getting under the cap to pick up players. This is getting under the cap just so you can play hockey, right? You've got Hronek at $4.4 million for another year, and then he's a restricted free agent next summer. So they have to convince Hronek to stick around long-term as well. And the acquisition of Hronek in part would be to try to show Pettersson, hey, look, we're trying to make things better here. Demko, $5 million a year until 2026. Mikheyev, who was injured most of last season, $4.75 million till 2026 as well. If he comes back and he's healthy, that'll help in the goal-scoring department. So the poll that was done by The Athletic, the public has the Canucks at a D in their overall grade. The fan base has them at a D+. And the difference seems to be the fan base giving free agency moves a B-, and the public giving the Canucks, I think it was a D. So that seems to be the big difference between the two. But fan base having the team at a D+ is not a ringing endorsement of the team either. But the change in confidence with the team from last year It's startling, the difference between the fan base and the public. The public, 18% are more confident in the Canucks, 58% less. And I get why they would say that, because last year going into the regular season, Boudreau looked like he was happy. The Canucks looked happy to be with him. We had Bruce, there it is. There was a lot of excitement coming out of a season where they almost charged their way into the playoffs, just fell short at the end. But the fan base, 74% say they're more excited and more confident, 11% say less. So I do find that odd, because for me personally, last year going into the playoffs, I thought, or going into the regular season, I thought, yeah, the Canucks should be a playoff team. If these improvements to this team work out, they're a playoff team. They absolutely should be. They were close. They only missed the playoffs by a few points in 2022. But 2023, they didn't miss by just a few. And then the moves they make in the offseason, again, tell you this is a team that's saying, hey, we believe we can get in the playoffs next year. And then you get into that argument about, well, are you trying to build to make the playoffs or build for a Stanley Cup? And it's different. Again, Vegas this year was highly aggressive in getting to that Stanley Cup and winning it. Prior to that, Colorado built slow. It was a slow build, and then they get hot in 2022, and they win themselves the Stanley Cup. Prior to that, Tampa Bay, they had just been excellent for years, and they won the Stanley Cup. They proved that if you just keep going at it, eventually you should break through and win that Stanley Cup. The Canucks haven't built that way. They haven't been like hyper aggressive. It's not like a Jack Eichel was going to go to Vancouver. And they're not a team either that took their time building up and built from within. So that's where the issue is for me when it comes to the Canucks. Now, of course, the owner being Francesco Aquilini, I am of the mind that Aquilini loves hockey, loves the Canucks. He does want the playoff revenues, obviously. It's obvious that the playoff revenues are much higher. Your tickets in the playoffs, you can charge a lot more than you can in the regular season. So it can be the difference between making money or not making money with NHL teams. But slow starts have hurt this team too. So 2022-2023, they started the season 2-6-2. The year before that, they were 4-5-1. The year before that, they were 5-5, but then ended up 8-11-1 after 20 games, and that was only a 56-game season. Now, the 3 seasons prior to that, they actually had good starts. The 2019-2020, they were 6-3-1. They made the playoffs, of course, in 2020. The 2 years prior, they were 6-4 and 6-3-1, and in both of those seasons, they fell off and they missed the playoffs. So the slow starts do show up prior to that as well. 4-5-1 in 2016-2017. 2015-2016, they were 4-2-4. So they only lost 2 in regulation, but they only won 4. So to me, again, that's a slow start, but that's me personally. So this is why for the Vancouver Canucks, when I'm ranking organizations and I look at other organizations, I say, yeah, I can't justify having them higher up. They haven't had a great draft record. They haven't had a great record of like awesome contracts signed for less than market value. Their trade record is iffy, and we'll see. Maybe Hronek is exactly what they needed. They had Soucy, they had Cole, and everything's great. Hughes can stay healthy all year, and this team ends up top 3 in the division. I got egg on my face. That's fine with me, because if the team's winning, then great. But a lot of things have to happen for that to happen, right? And this is a team that, again, over the last 3 years, I've watched as their starts have been anticlimactic. To get to 5-5, they had to go on a winning streak to get to 5-5. And then immediately they went into another losing streak after that. And that was in the Canadian division, which was seen as being the weakest of the divisions in the NHL that year. And still, they had their struggles. They ended up finishing near the bottom of that division. And that's where the pessimism kind of took over. Then Bruce Boudreau comes in. And the way that the Canucks treated Boudreau on his way out, again, it did not sit well with a lot of hockey fans. Didn't sit well with me. Still doesn't. But this is something that will, sort of sit in the back of your mind. And when looking at the Canucks coming into this season, I would love to see them do really well. I'd love to see Demko stay healthy, because I do have some concerns about the backup goaltending. Silovs looked great. He looked good in Abbotsford as well. Is he the backup? If it's Martin, can Martin do it? Last year, Martin had some of the worst stats. And again, no, they'll be fine if Martin only plays 25 games. Well, yeah, so Demko can't get hurt. And Demko's going to have to play a lot. That's a problem, because if you're going to play your goaltender a lot because you don't have a lot of faith in the backup, the odds of that goaltender getting hurt, well, that goes up. and then you find yourself in a situation where you could have Spencer Martin and Artur Silovs as your goaltenders, and you're trying to stay in a playoff race and maybe make it above the playoff line. And again, looking at the rest of the teams in the Western Conference, I'm not sure which team they're going to jump past. I mean, just the top three from last year, I can't see them passing Vegas, Edmonton, and Seattle. Really well coached team, solid roster from top to bottom. I don't know that they can get ahead of Seattle either. Then you've got Calgary. Are they going to be better than Calgary? There's that possibility. They really need Calgary or Winnipeg to drop off, or both, really. And then they need to hope that Nashville doesn't get better and St. Louis doesn't get better. So it is not an easy road either way. And then that brings me back to my point, which is this is a team that's made the playoffs once since 2015. They've never done a rebuild. And we are still talking about this team as maybe a playoff team, possibly. If things fall their way, they could be. And meanwhile, you've got teams that have gone through rebuilds that started in 2015 or were in the midst in 2015, and they're absolutely fantastic. So that's the thing. You know, that's where we're at right now. The Vancouver Canucks, a team that still looks middle of the road, and they've had a lot of time to turn things around. And yes, Alvin has not been GM for that long, but I do still have my doubts. So if people want to call that hate, they can, and they do. And if people want to say, well, he's being tough on Vancouver because he's a fan, well, no. Because according to the polling, and this was over 11,000 fans, the team just does not have a good ranking. Fans don't have a lot of confidence in them. For instance, for the fan base to say 74% have more confidence, that could mean they've gone from none to little. That could mean they've gone to little to some. So if you really want to get pessimistic, you can with that number. But yeah, that's where I'm at with Vancouver. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. And again, if they prove me wrong and they win a bunch of games and they get to the Stanley Cup playoffs, I will be very happy. And if they prove they're a contender in the playoffs, I'll be overjoyed and absolutely stunned by it. But I do have some concerns. And again, this is a storyline we've been repeating since, I want to say since 2016, where they missed the playoffs. Ever since then, it's been, we're close, we're close, we're close. We'll just add a few players here. We think if we add a couple guys here, we're solid. And it seems to always kind of fall apart. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Are you more confident, less confident? Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.